When faith meets local power, who decides the limits? A recent court case puts religious expression, municipal authority, and constitutional rights on a collision course, the implications far beyond one city. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of the question, is your faith shaping your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us today. First, we have Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, who's Vice President of Government Relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. We also have with us Dr. Nia Johnson, Assistant Professor at Wake Forest Law School. We have Mr. Antoine Thompson, former New York State Delegate and State Senator. And we have Mr. Stephen Allred, Director of Government Relations for the Church State Council. Looking forward to our conversation, and I think we're going to learn something new today. A recent study surveyed nearly 37,000 U.S. adults and paints a portrait of a community where belief or lack thereof shapes neighborhoods, generations, and daily life. Knowing that the U.S. has a population of roughly 262 million adults, with Christianity claiming about 162 million adherents and 76 million people reporting no religious affiliation, Pew researchers acknowledge that grasping the full scope of faith in America can feel overwhelming. These are big numbers that can make it difficult to fully understand the American religious landscape, the report states. But what if we imagine the U.S. as a small town of about 100 people, instead of a country with hundreds of millions of people? If the U.S. were a small town of 100 people, religious nuns would outnumber Protestants among young people, according to Pew. In the scaled-down version of America, Christians would still hold a clear majority, numbering 62 out of 100, but the breakdown reveals familiar American Christian and Christian identified traditions will start to fade away. You know, Stephen, when we start taking a look at people talking about America being a religious country, and some of us even talk about the fact that, you know, we're a Christian country, we're actually starting to see that the numbers of individuals who have no beliefs at all, or what we now affectionately call the nuns, they seem to be picking up at a larger and larger rate. That it makes you wonder, how important is religion going to be in the United States? Maybe not today, but where it might be down the road, because a young population sees religion very differently.
No, it's true. And I think, you know, the Pew Research surveys that I think we're referring to here, you know, paint a picture of a very pluralistic country, and it's becoming more that way, it seems like. So I think, you know, that needs to be something that we take into account, you know, when we talk about policies and things like that in our nation. And I think what's also fascinating, Orlin, is that there is kind of a phenomenon of cultural Christianity as well, even among the nuns. Like, for example, I think about like Elon Musk or Richard Dawkins, who is an atheist, right? He's an atheist, but they appreciate, they say, some of the cultural trappings, I guess you could say, of Christianity, which I find fascinating, because there seems to be kind of this idea that the Christianity brings something to the public square. And then you have, of course, a wide spectrum of views on what that should look like. But yeah, this pluralistic reality, I think, is here to stay. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think we as Christians need to think, how do we reach, you know, those who don't share our beliefs, not through imposing it on them by law, but through, you know, reaching them with persuasion and evangelism.
No, Antoine, you're somebody who's been in the New York State legislature in both houses, and this question of Christianity being the big thing in town, or a younger generation viewing religion being a different way. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, first let me say thank you for having me. As someone who is a very dedicated member of First Baptist Church of Glenarden. My great-grandfather was a Baptist minister in Arkansas. My mother is an ordained minister as well. and been an usher on and off throughout my life as well, and part of First Touch Ministry. One project that I tried to do years ago when I was on the city council in Buffalo, and I love to do with churches, I think we need to get more out in the community talking with folks. The churches that have more ministries are growing. Churches that are more strict with the Bible, but more outgoing and can be relationship based with some of the younger generation. Many of them are facing all different type of challenges, not like our great grandparents did, a little different. But I think it's important for churches to be in the schools, do different ministries, everything from social media to life skills. I mean, our church has over 100 different ministries, so there's pretty much something for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a lot of management, but also people can find themselves somewhere in the church. And so I think that it's important for churches to continue to preach the word, the gospel, but also, as they say, get out into those highways and the hedges.
I'll also add into this discussion. I mean, it's interesting because, like, obviously, like Pew is like one of the most prestigious research institutions on polling in the country. But there's also been, like, data that's been shown about the way that Gen Z specifically engages with church, which is essentially that they actually are heading there in increasing numbers, right? There's some, surveys done by The Guardian and some other institutions that are looking at how Gen Z engages with church, and they may be a little bit more engaged with church than their previous generations, or at least in a belief structure. But I think part of what we should be taking into account when we see these type of things is not only questions about pluralism, but also why are people being drawn back to churches, and is it for the wrong reasons, right? And this isn't necessarily like a new concept, right? Like this is something that folks have talked about in the child abuse context, right? Where, folks who potentially were predators were actually looking for churches because they knew that the barrier to entry was low, right? And so they used it as a forum to harm other people. Now, this is not to say that, like churches filled with predators or et cetera, but I think it's important that if we start to see an influx of younger people who are entering into religious spaces, we should also not just be excited that they're there, but be curious about why they are there. Because if church is becoming a forum for them to engage in harmful behavior, or at least what the data is showing about Gen Z more specifically, is that they are coming to church because they are frustrated with their relationships with women, right? Or rather, men are frustrated with their relationships with women. They're coming to churches because they are frustrated with their economic situation, and they feel like church and Christian theology, kind of to Stephen's point, is a place that actually makes them feel better about their circumstances, that really is masking animosity regarding equality, right? And we should not be harboring those type of ideas and those type of things, especially because if you're consider yourself to be a Bible-believing church, that is actually contrary to the Christian Bible. When you think of the women that, were held up in Christ's ministry, amongst other things, right? Like we should not be sheltering that type of ideology. So I think we also need to, be curious and say, okay, we're happy you're here, but also, why are you here? Right? Like what are you looking for in this institution,
Galen, you run a large organization with, many different genders, National Association of Evangelicals. You must be noticing that there's a kind of separation with how younger people, quote unquote, talk about being religious, as opposed to maybe older people like myself think about being religious.
Well, as Dr. Johnson has pointed out, there is an upsurge in young people showing interest in faith, which I think is very encouraging. I think a couple other things about the data that are interesting to observe. One is that the number of the nuns, as they're called, seems to be plateauing. It had been growing, rather sharply for some years, and then the last few years it's been pretty much level. So we don't know if that's a temporary or a permanent change in the trajectory. But there may be a sort of an upper limit of how many people actually don't have any faith. But then secondly, that group of nuns also includes a lot of people with religious thoughts and feelings and ideas, but who say that they are nothing in particular. So there's a sort of a general spiritual interest but it hasn't coalesced in a denominational or traditional, specificity. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to engage with people and to see what their spiritual needs are and to help them to see that actually in community is where we find God, not just on our own.
Mm-hmm.
Antoine, what's kind of interesting is that, you were talking about so many ministries, for example, at your church. There are a lot of young people that I believe and talk to. They think, listen, I'm a part of this ministry, and therefore that's my religion. Some of us think that the ministry was just a part of their religion. A lot of these young people think the ministry is 100% of their religion. And I don't know if there's a problem with that, but I think just the nomenclature that we use to describe what's being religious, going to church, being a part of the ministry, they're kind of breaking this up in thoughts, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting part, so my mom has a ministry and she does a thing called Prayer in the Park. So she's been doing prayer in parks for over 20 years. That's her ministry. But she is also a member of a church. And was when she got ordained, it was at a church. And I think that whatever gets people there on the path of Christianity, I think it's important. But I think that also is getting them in the building or getting them watching the service, getting them to believe that there's something greater than them, and it happens to be Jesus Christ, I think is really important. And I often, as my pastor say, I tell people what God has done for me, right? Because I come from very humble beginnings. My father was in jail when I was born. I was a baby that was not supposed to live beyond a year. And I came and my mom worked hard, but she never made over $18,000 when I was growing up. And we were on every anti-poverty program that's available. And now I've been able to take that life experience, because by the grace of God in a village, to be able to do some great things. And I know if it were not for God, I would not be wearing the clothes that I wear, doing the type of jobs that I do, ascending to different public and private leadership positions, but only by the grace of God. So I give them that testimony, and then that's up to them to decide whether or not they believe it can happen for them too.
Yeah.
I would love to jump in and just add one quick point about the whole, is the ministry the religion? I think there's also a question amongst, maybe let's just cap it at folks under 40 who are querying, can we be a body of doers, right? This has also been a critique of the church at large, or Judeo-Christian religions, the idea that, there's a lot that's happening when it comes to the theater that happens in the pews, but it isn't really, reaching the community. And so I think for some people, even stories I've heard of what people do with tithe, right? There was a time where you tithe to a church, and now there are folks who are I donate to this organization 10% of my earnings, right? That's my form of tithing. So I think, it just may be a little bit more complex, but, at least we know, what is it? They say, there are workers in the vineyard. There are people who want to do things. And I think that's also some of what we're seeing.
And can I just add also, one of the other dynamics in reducing the number of Christians has been the campaign of mass deportations, because about 80% of the people who are being deported are Christians. And many of those not being allowed to come here as refugees also are persecuted Christians. So that's another dynamic to keep in mind.
Well, thank you, Galen. I don't let that be the last word on this, but it seems as though what we're looking at is a transforming community, but even transforming definition of what's religion, what is ministry, the combination thereof, or maybe even the separation of them. Coming up, a city faces a lawsuit for the construction of a monument because of its religious implications. Stay right there. We'll be back after this. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called Fitzmaurice versus the city of Quincy. The city of Quincy is in Massachusetts and is building a new public safety headquarters for its police and fire departments. As part of the design, the city planned to install statues of Michael the Archangel and Florian, two figures with deep significance to police and firefighter communities. The ACLU sued to stop the construction, claiming that Quincy could not honor its first responders in this way because Michael and Florian have religious meaning to some. Across the country, police and fire departments have long used figures of Michael the Archangel and Florian, an early Roman firefighter, to symbolize their ideals of their professions. Fire departments use Florian cross as their emblem. Police officers often identify with Michael. They pursue their goal of protecting communities against wrongdoers. You know, Galen, when we take a look at what's happening here, on one hand, this is just a construction project. And on one hand, this is a construction project impacting public safety officials. But somehow it has turned into a question of, is somebody's religious points of view dominating something that's happening in the public sphere, and not just in the public sphere, but with public safety, and somebody comes in and throws a flag and says, penalty on the play, too much Jesus, let's back out of this. Where do we draw the line here, or is this a bridge too far?
Well, of course, the underlying question here is whether these are religious or cultural symbols, and possibly they're both, and as is the case in many times. In the federal jurisprudence, there is a recognition that things that are part of a history and tradition may have a religious root, but also fill a cultural or secular function as well. And so there have been cases like, a large cross that was memorial cross that was allowed to be erected on parkland, for example. So in this case, the case is being heard under Massachusetts state law and constitution, not federal. Massachusetts, of course, like most of the colonies, originally had an established church, the Puritans or Congregationalists, but they, in 1833, amended their constitution so that now it prohibits any denominational preferences. And the idea of denominational preferences is actually a stricter standard than just being neutral in matters of religion. So I think we'll have to see how the state Supreme Court rules on this. But in my mind, it's important to keep this in context. Florian and Michael are symbols that police and firefighters often use as an inspiration, and that's fine. On the other hand, if it is a religious symbol and it's being co-opted, then that's also can be a concern to religious people. We don't want the cross, for example, to become just a secular symbol and used for other things. We'll have to see how the court rules, but I would caution against reading too much into this in terms of putting in the template of culture war issues. I think this is one that probably we could come to some common agreement on.
Steve, you see common agreement coming here?
Who knows? I mean, you'd have to be, I guess, a prophet to figure that out. But I mean, if history is anything, you've got the ACLU here on one side, and it seems like we tend to like to stretch things to their extreme on kind of both sides of the culture war, and it's unfortunate because it does tend to, I think, the reaction or the action creates a reaction, and it just continues to become more and more extreme. And so this is where the court's going to need the wisdom of Solomon here, and also some guidance. I think, and if we're looking at history though and tradition, I think it's important for us as Christians to say, wait a minute, what kind of country do we want to have though too? If we were living in a country where the history of that country was some other religion that's not Christianity, would we want that country doing the same with their, cultural religious symbols? Yeah. And so it comes down to the golden rule, and I think if we as Christians could just say, listen, let's try to live that out in how we even conduct ourselves in public when it comes to these types of things, I think it would go a long way in just winning people over. Like in this case, quickly, I think the mayor here failed to allow public comment on the statues. That's what the ACLU is claiming, at least. Even if that had happened, I think some of this maybe could have been avoided. And who knows, maybe the public would have said, this is a great idea, let's go with it. But it seems like, unfortunately, we're kind of, again, maybe not acting in good faith always. And we need to live by that golden rule.
Yeah, I think like again, some of this is like cultural anxiety in like both directions, right? Like we're talking about Massachusetts, right? Which has definitely been, a pioneer, I think, in many areas of policy that we may consider to be like blue issues, right? So we talk like health policy, healthcare, universal coverage, et cetera, gay marriage, so I can see how this can kind of become a site for this type of conversation. But again, like as some of us have said, even when we filmed this show before, that, a lot of this is also about the ways that Christians position themselves in the public sphere, and how, folks are, not to use too colloquial of a term, but are getting their lick back, right? In whatever ways that they may see fit. I think, as Stephen said, like a lot of this is about restraint, right? And thinking about global ways to prevent these type of lawsuits before we get there. But one other thing I will say is that, the secularization of symbols is not new, right? There are just, times when you have historical symbols that align with like an ideal that's tied to a religion, but that's no longer the case.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also worth, again, this is why notice and comment is so important, right? Because there are parts of New England that do have large religious populations or folks who are working in these public industries that we need, like being firefighters and such. And so had we just asked and went through the process, then we may have actually found out something important about this history that can actually be added to legislative context or legal context in the future, right? So this is also why, skipping steps in the administrative process is problematic, because it may actually give you knowledge you need for future lawsuits or even future legislation.
That's a good point. Antoine, you probably come from the home of what I would call NYPD and FP, the fire department. They're considered to be almost bigger than the city and the country almost. The idea that their representatives, statues and things of that nature have a religious connotation, I would almost imagine that was on purpose, And the idea of now a society saying we've got to try to figure out how to separate something, it almost makes you wonder, if it isn't broke, why are we trying to fix it? I mean, or am I missing something here, Antoine? What are your thoughts, man?
Well, I think that religion has been at the core of America. It's always been like this paradoxical situation, because while we've been religion, we haven't always practiced religion in its broadest context for a variety of purposes. But when we look at the dollar bill, when we look at our governmental offices, our statues, our monuments, some of our arts and cultural facilities, you can see the fabric of Christianity in it. And I think that's a good thing. We may not always be in the same pew, but we're in the same church. And we are a diverse America, and that's for a reason. But we are a Christian-centric country, but we respect the diversity of religion. And I think that's okay. I mean, some people worship differently, and that's okay. But I think the core of the message of how do we get here, that was intentional, it was deliberate, and I think that's what has made America one of the greatest places on earth. It's not been perfect, but it's that continuation that only thing that is perfect is Christ, right? Everything else falls short of the grace of God, and I think that is the spiritual and religious thing that makes America unique.
One thing that we have to say our nation got right was in the freedom that we guarantee, both free exercise, but also that we don't have a state-sponsored church. And the church is much stronger, and faith groups are much stronger because of that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we don't insist that the public square be scrubbed of all trace of faith because that's part of life as well. And so there's I think a generous room for having faith expressions, not sponsored by government, but allowed by government, and by people who are even people who participate in government, but who also are people of faith. And so, there's always margins where we have to figure where we're going to draw lines. But overall, I think, especially when you look at other countries and those that have state-sponsored religions and those that are opposed to religion altogether, we're definitely in a better place.
If I could jump in,
Sure.
I think it's interesting too to see how, as we become a more pluralistic country, as we spoke about earlier, you look at places like parts of Michigan where there's a large concentration of Muslims, and this gets back to that golden rule concept for me, because would Christians be comfortable in that context with, let's say, some sort of a representation of the Islamic faith that was in public, and a lot of Christians wouldn't, right? They would say that's not cool. And so I think, again, it's this mutual respect, this we need to be thinking, how do we as a pluralistic society treat each other with respect? And if we're wanting to win people over, I mean, the best way to do it is through, love and persuasion, and not force or using government to promote our cause. And when it comes to religion.
Yeah, I think that's probably the point that we kind of get uncomfortable with. The fact that we are living in a pluralistic type society where there's one group that always thinks that they're probably the best, right? You show up in a room and everybody thinks they're the smartest, we've got the best religion, we're closer to the ideal, but getting to a point where we're comfortable with understanding that we can have a lot of different people and you can be quote unquote unified without having to be uniform. And I think once we get more comfortable with that, that's when I think we're showing the best of America and the best of the world. Hey, Steve, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, this is a very random fact, as normal with me here, but did you know that crows, the bird, often hold grudges against specific people, and they can actually recognize people and remember who they are, and they can figure out who they think is a good person or a bad person, and they will reward their friends with gifts. So that's just a little for today.
I got to stop shooing them away from my trash can then. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So did you know that there are larger shares of younger adults who are using AI with their mental health challenges because they can't afford the cost of healthcare?
Galen, tell me something I don't know.
The Hebrew word ger appears 92 times in the Old Testament. It's the word for immigrant.
Antoine, tell me something I don't know.
Yes, transportation is the number one cause of pollution in the United States of America and contributing to higher rates of asthma as well.
Wow. Well, listen, ladies and gentlemen, appreciate our conversation. They learned a whole lot. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.